All right, everybody. So today, let's get going with our Unit 1 lecture. Obviously, it's titled Global Trade and Transformations. We're going to be looking at how sort of the age of exploration, colonization, and et cetera impacted the world on a global scale. So let's begin with some course logistics. A reminder that you will need to submit your Unit 1 reading reflections by the last day of the unit. You can find that sort of guide, that outline that you'll use for every reading reflection in Brightspace under Content, Reading Reflections, and Lecture Guides, and you'll download that. Remember to compile them into one file. You can download it as a Word document and then just have keep a running Word file with all of those reflections, right? Don't submit 5 different files into those reading reflections. For this lecture today, follow along with your lecture guide and submit that by the end of the unit. Same thing, you can find your personalized Unit 1 lecture guide in Brightspace under Content, Reading Guides, and Lecture Guides. Download it, follow it along, submit it. And then a reminder that your unit quizzes will be based on lecture and reading. So a quick note on lecture, right? Lectures will be synthesizing information from each unit to create a holistic story. So I'm not necessarily going to be going page for page according to what your readings are saying. My sort of purpose of these unit lectures here is I want to tell you the story that this sort of unit is trying to tell, right? So although these lectures will be compatible to the information that's included in your readings, they will not always present the information in the same order as your textbook, and they'll likely present information that is in addition to or supplemental to your textbook. Finally, use your lecture guides and your reading reflections together to get an overall understanding of the unit. So today's agenda, we've got Introduction to History. We have the world before the age of exploration. We're going to move on to how that age of exploration transformed really the globe. And then we're going to talk about the New World briefly. So let's begin with a short little introduction to history, right? So there's something I want to talk really quickly about, what history is and how we use history, why we should care about history to understand sort of what's going on today, right? The only way to understand our present, where we're living right now, is to understand our past, right? History in and of itself is a series of events, interactions, connections, building upon each other to get us where we are today. Human communities have not developed by remaining isolated from each other, but really through interaction and explorations. The only way that we've been able to innovate, grow, explore has been by interacting with each other, interacting with different parts of the world, and really innovating in that manner. So in this class, we're going to consider how the modern world has been sort of building upon previous events beginning in the 1500s. Now, obviously, very important history happened prior to 1500, but for the purposes of this class, we're going to look and see how the 1500s, the early modern period, served as a foundation for how we can understand sort of the modern world. So let's talk about the world before colonization. Let's start with Europe. Before the age of exploration, Europe was largely divided into independent nation states. That meant it was sort of smaller kingdoms, smaller sort of political organizations. There was not necessarily sort of like one leader ruling over wide swaths of territory, right? And that is until 1519, when the Habsburg King Charles V, he came from the Habsburg family, becomes emperor over territories in Central and Western Europe, as well as the Americas, creating a brief global empire. Now, that empire fractures. In some aspects, it remains sort of together with the Spanish Empire. But this is really sort of the first moment of a truly global empire. However, throughout the majority of the early modern era, which we think of as sort of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, Europe will largely sort of remain divided amongst regional nation states, those smaller groups. At the same time that these sort of smaller groupings are happening, the growth of some sort of global empires, there is also massive religious upheaval happening in Europe at this time. In particular, we have the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is a movement led by Martin Luther, to break away from the Catholic Church and reform Christianity. And this, in essence, what it really does, it creates a massive rift as Christianity splits between Protestants and Catholics. And this will result in numerous religious wars, numerous political upheavals. Really, this profoundly shatters Europe and reshapes sort of political, social, and religious understandings of Europe at this time. In this aftermath, intolerance between the two groups grows. And like I said, it results in not only religious wars, but also growing rates of witch hunts, right? Using this intolerance of Protestants, of Catholics, or whatever, to target enemies and assume, sort of, build upon this anxiety, build upon this fear, and target questionable individuals as being linked to the devil or linked to sort of witchcraft. Here's a brief image that depicts how, you know, fears of witchcraft, of devils, of sort of evil influences at this time would have sort of taken hold and grappled and really had people in sort of the grip of fear and anxiety. Now let's move on to the Americas. For the sake of this class, we're really only going to look at Mexico and Peru today. In both cases, both regions were ruled by extensive and complex indigenous empires. So in Mexico, we have the Aztec Empire, which was ruled by the Mexica people. This was sort of a largely decentralized empire with subjugated states that had local autonomy as long as they offered sufficient tribute, right? So we'll look at a graphic in a second. But as long as those, states that the Mexica people had conquered in central Mexico, as long as they, paid what they needed to pay, gave the Mexica the tribute that was required, like, hey, you're good. You rule how you want to rule. As long as you stay loyal to me, give me what I want, we're all good. In Peru, um, the Inca Empire is really sort of the primary empire at the time that we're talking about, and this was ruled by the Incans. Now, in contrast to the Aztec Empire, they had much more of a centralized control, right? There was very strong oversight by the Inca ruler to keep subjugated territories in line. This often took the form of sort of forced labor contracts, moving sort of individuals from these subjugated territories into different parts of the kingdom to conduct public works, to serve nobles, to maintain the empire, etc. But really, what we can think of between the two is that the Aztec Empire really, as long as you give me what I'm asking for, you can rule how you want. Like, we're all good, we're happy. The Inca Empire is going to be, you will, you know, bow to me, you will be part of this Incan Empire, and I will tell you how you are going to be ruling your territory. So, here's a brief graphic of sort of the Aztec Empire circa 1519, right? So we can see here Tenochtitlan, which we know today as Mexico City, was sort of the core state, it was sort of the ruling territory here. This is where sort of the Aztec emperor lived and sort of maintains control. You can see all this pink area right here are going to be those tributary states, right? Those individuals that, as long as you paid the tribute, as long as you gave them what they asked for, it was fine. And then we have a little bit of an allied state here, which they're not necessarily sort of subjugated, right? It's more sort of an ally, more seen as an equal. And I want to point out here in this middle, we have Tlaxcala. And this right here, you can see it's not a color at all. The Tlaxcalans were an independent people. They were adversaries, they were enemies of the Aztec Empire, and they were surrounded. So they will play a pivotal role when it comes to sort of colonizing the Americas because they will end up helping the Spaniards against their enemy, the Mexica, the Aztec Empire. So they were not always sort of working together. Let's move on. This is another graphic of the Incan Empire. As you can see, right, the sort of darker red colors is where it sort of started out in the 1200s. And you can see really, I mean, it grows somewhat throughout the 1400s, but from 1463 to 1525 is really when they do that like key expansion. You can see it goes all the way up to Quito, and all the way down basically to almost the bottom of the South American continent. So key expansion, a large amount of territory to maintain sort of control over. So let's move on to sort of the third region that we're talking about before exploration, and that is going to be Africa. Now, the estimated population by the age of exploration in Africa was about 100 million. There was quite a lot of individuals living in Africa. Now, primarily, these were divided into chiefdoms, right? Sort of smaller political groups run by a chief, but there were several dozen kingdoms and at least two large empires. This includes the Mali Empire that really ran from 1250 to 1450 CE. Now, I'll take a moment to say that CE will stand for Common Era. Basically, that's the time that we're living in now. BCE would be sort of before Common Era. That's very, very ancient. So anytime you see CE, it's sort of just the Common Era that we're living in now. So the Mali Empire really sort of developed their wealth and power based on gold and salt coming out of Timbuktu. Timbuktu was a critical trade center. It was not only a trade center for goods, but it was also sort of a center for knowledge, for scholarship, and for religious study. So it was really the foundation of the Mali Empire. Now, following sort of the fall of the Mali Empire, we have the Songhai Empire that sort of began in 1000, but really came to prominence after the fall of the Mali Empire in the 1400s, and really continues until 1600. Now, this was a very strong, unified empire. Islam was the official religion. There was a very clear understanding that Islam ran throughout the Songhai Empire. They had a social system that was similar to a caste system, meaning that they had a very clear sort of stratification between nobles, commoners, slaves, war captives, etc. That means that society was very strictly separated into different groups. Following the fall of the Mali Empire, once the Songhai Empire comes into its own, they take over control of Timbuktu and they turn it into even more of a center of learning, to the point where Timbuktu's university attracts scholars from really across the world because it is so renowned. So, although Islam is dominant in North Africa, the vast majority of African tribes worshipped local deities. So, there would be local gods, local sort of beings, etc., that would create sort of a local religion. At the same time, more than 2,000 languages are spoken throughout the continent at this time. And although herding livestock and subsistence agriculture is very popular, you also have mining and metalworking, goldworking, and trading as very common professions. And that includes slave traders. So slave trading in Africa was present prior to the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, which we will talk about in a second. But before we go any further, please pause this lecture and go to question 1 under step 3, engaging with the lecture content questions. I want you to take 2 to 3 minutes in answering the following question. How do pre-exploration Europe, the Americas, and Africa compare? Are there any similarities that you can see, and what about differences? So I'll pause that. I'll wait 1 second so that you can pause. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about the age of exploration. So, as European maritime technology advances, European explorers are reaching further distances. They are starting to sort of expand out of local maritime, adventuring around the coast, and are really starting to get into Asia, get into Africa, and ultimately get into the New World. So these motivations include searching for new lands and resources, They want to establish new trade relationships, and which will be key, particularly in the Americas, is the idea of spreading the influence of Christianity. So, beginning in the 15th century, explorers start to seek routes to Asia via the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's really sort of a fight to see who can get the best route to Asia through the oceans, right? There were already well established routes overland, but with sort of new maritime technology, new sort of efforts to explore and to expand, there's the idea that perhaps European kingdoms, such as Portugal, can find a quicker route to Asia via the ocean. And this leads us to perhaps one of the most fateful encounters, which is Columbus's accidental discovery of America. So, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, he is sort of a genuine sort of explorer and sailor. He acquires funding by the Spanish crown, so by the Spanish monarchy, to find this sort of ocean route to Asia. He insists that he can find a transatlantic route leaving from sort of the coast of Spain, sailing west and hitting Asia. Now, obviously, we know there is a giant continent in the middle of that. That would be the Americas. And therefore, on October 12th, 1492, Columbus lands in what is now the Bahamas. He establishes sort of a temporary settlement. He sort of explores the islands. Obviously, he was not anticipating landing here at first. He does believe that he is in Asia, but he writes this really, really convincing letter to the Spanish crown and is like, "Hey, I know this isn't what you were asking for. I know this isn't what we were like planning on doing, but it turns out we found this island." And he starts sort of really hyping up not only the resources, he will honestly include a lot of hyperbole about sort of the resources, saying there's gold everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. There's not necessarily in the Bahamas, and highlighting how the local peoples are, you know, perfect for Christianization, will ultimately, temporarily, be enslaved, and some will be taken back to Spain. But he really sort of convinces the Spanish crown that this is a good idea. So he's allowed to return. And in 1493, Columbus's second voyage brings 1,500 Spaniards. He brings livestock, he brings clothing, he brings tools, and he brings 17 ships to Hispaniola in sort of the Bahamas, the Caribbean area. And with that, Spanish colonization has begun. So, Columbus landing in the Bahamas is really sort of the beginning of quite an intense colonization campaign on the part of the Spaniards. So by the end of the 1530s, the Spanish have established colonies in Mexico and South America. They have really taken control of the Aztec Empire. They have used internal conflicts to take control of the Incan Empire and have established control over large swaths of land. Now, the Portuguese quickly follow suit, and they are able to establish the colony of Brazil. Obviously, this creates some tensions between Portugal and Spain as to who the Americas quote unquote belong to, right? This is very much a debate going on in Europe. Obviously, indigenous communities in the Americas are not being brought into these discussions. So it is a very European discussion of who the Americas belong to. And in 1494, the Pope issues the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divides the Americas between Spanish and Portuguese control. So by the early 1600s, Spain, France, Portugal, and Britain have established settler colonies, meaning they have established permanent colonies where Europeans immigrate to live. And this creates the sort of British colonies in North America, Spanish colonies, French colonies in what is now Canada, Portuguese colonies in what is now Brazil. So although Europeans have sort of established control over the Americas with these new American colonies, they're not interested in just staying there, right? They had maintained trading posts in Asia for centuries. So in 1565, the Spaniards capture the Philippines, initiating a critical trade route between Asia and Mexico. With the sort of, capture of the Philippines, this allows the Spaniards to directly ship goods from Asia to the western coast of Mexico, primarily Acapulco. Acapulco was and still is a key trading port, but particularly during the colonial period was critical for this transfer of goods between Asia, the Americas, and then subsequently Europe. Although there is some European engagement in Australia and other Pacific islands, um, European explorers often look down upon these areas, these territories, because the indigenous communities are primarily foraging, and instead they decide to focus on brief trading, right? Whereas in the Americas, there were very well established indigenous communities, both in sort of British North America and Mexico and Peru, as we have talked about. So let's pause once more. And I want you to go to question 2 under step 3 and answer the following question. What were the overall motivations for European exploration? How did European interactions in the Americas versus the Pacific, include a versus right there, between the Americas and the Pacific. How did European interactions in the Americas versus the Pacific differ? Now, I will pause, give a couple seconds, pause this video, answer the question, and then come meet me back in a couple of seconds. Okay, so let's move on to the Atlantic slave trade. As I said earlier, slavery had really been present in Africa for centuries prior to the slave trade. Primarily, this had been through the form of war captives or criminals. So, with internal conflicts between different African tribes, different chiefdoms, different empires, slaves were taken in this fashion in the form of war captives or criminals within their own sort of society. As diseases destroyed indigenous populations in the Americas, European colonizers are looking for laborers. So the slave trade begins. Now, in addition to sort of massive deaths within indigenous populations due to disease, there was also a brief series of debates and discussions in the early 1500s, particularly within sort of the Spanish Empire, that ultimately stated that indigenous populations could not be sort of enslaved or become indentured workers due to the fact that they had never been exposed to Christianity before. So that Christianization mission became the top priority for indigenous populations, pushing European colonizers to look for laborers in the form of sort of African slaves. Now, this slave trade becomes sort of a key part of the triangular trade, which is the cycle of trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So here is a graphic of how we can understand the slave trade and the triangular trade, right? So you can see that enslaved Africans are forcibly relocated to the Americas. There, they are forced to sort of harvest or produce raw materials that are then shipped to Europe, where they are turned into manufactured goods, which are then shipped to Africa, not only for sort of trading posts, for goods to be traded with African sort of chiefdoms or kingdoms or tribes in exchange for African slaves, and then the cycle sort of begins again. So let's talk about the African diaspora. The African diaspora can be sort of described as the dispersal of African peoples and their descendants, primarily due to this forced relocation of African slaves to the Americas through that transatlantic slave trade. Most enslaved Africans end up in Caribbean and American plantations. And we'll look at a video in a second. But a smaller minority did live in urban settings as domestic slaves or skilled workers, right? So the vast majority are taken to very rural settings, forced into very hard physical labor in Caribbean and American plantations, whether that is for tobacco, whether that is for sugar, whether that is for coffee, whatever. There is a smaller minority that is taken to Mexico City, that is taken to sort of urban settings in the Caribbean, in British North America, where they do become domestic slaves or skilled workers in a very urban setting. So I am going to pause. I'm going to put this link below this video on Brightspace. I want you to click that link, take a couple of seconds, look at that interactive visualization of the forced relocation of African slaves. It starts from the earliest period of the transatlantic slave trade and continues throughout sort of the 1800s, and really highlights the intense volume, the sheer volume of forced relocations of African individuals from Africa into sort of enslaved settings in the Americas. So pause here, click that link, and come right back. So, with the influx of goods and resources coming from the Americas because of that triangular trade established with colonization, European populations start to grow and cities get larger. So, because of these changes that are sort of being, brought on by colonialism, this rapid growth results in economic development and the emergence of capitalism. Now, we are likely familiar with capitalism in a certain form in terms of it being part of our current economy. But we can define capitalism as an economic system in which private organizations or individuals make their goods and services available on a free market and seek to take advantage of market conditions for profit, right? So it is very much between private organizations and individuals taking advantage of supply and demand to determine how much their profit is, what their price is, etc. Um, so this capitalist development boosts standards of rural life in Western Europe. So not only do cities get larger in Western Europe, but so do sort of the standards of life in a rural setting as well. So you can really see both in an urban and rural sort of setting the impact of capitalism in Europe following the colonization of the Americas. At the same time that all of this, international exchange, colonization, and et cetera is happening, there are many sort of social and political changes happening as well due to the effects of exploration and colonialism. In particular, colonialism creates sort of intellectual transformations as scholars in Europe are grappling with sort of the effects of colonization upon local individuals, as well as upon sort of um, the forced relocations of African slaves. In one hand, you do have the scientific revolution. Now, this is sort of the incorporation of observation and mathematics to transform the natural sciences. Prior to this, there was much more of a reliance on sort of religious beliefs. And sort of social ideas. But the scientific revolution really created the idea of using observation and math to understand natural sciences such as sort of chemistry, biology, etc. Um, because of this, there is also sort of the overhaul of existing ideas of morality, of social divisions, of political structures, as more and more ideas are coming out about sort of the role of humans, the division of society in a much more global setting, and sort of the political structure of a traditional sort of monarchy. There are new ideas coming out that are starting to question these established norms. And this results in particular in the weakening influence of the church, both Protestant and Catholic, and explaining the world through secular means. So, what I mean by that is it is less about explaining the world through religion and much more so explaining the world through sort of non religious terms, whether that is scientific, whether that is sort of moral or political. But there's a really shift in understanding sort of the world around us at that time. So, what can we consider the main takeaways from the age of exploration, from colonization, and from the impacts of colonization in Europe and the world stage in general? Primarily, Europe during the age of exploration experienced significant political, social, and economic shifts. If you take anything away, it's the fact that the age of the exploration changed completely how Europeans, how, indigenous societies in the Americas and African tribes in Africa understood the world around them. Prior to colonization, Africa and the Americas boasted diverse civilizations that included empires such as the Inca, the Aztecs, and the Songhai. There, were very much diverse groups of individuals already living in these areas, unlike what the Europeans thought when they landed, right? So when Europeans arrived in Africa and the Americas, there was generally this idea that no one was there, no developed societies were there, and that's just simply not the case. It was in fact quite the opposite. At the same time, the transfer of goods and resources from the Americas to Europe and into Africa creates this triangular trade, boosting the development of capitalism in Europe and linking these three continents together for centuries. And because of this, such global exploration, colonization, expansion really results in upheaval, both political, social, and economic, that pushes scholars to start reevaluating the world around them and establishing new scientific principles, right? So we can see here in and of itself the way that the age of exploration builds into the colonial era, builds into the triangular trade, builds into capitalism, builds into sort of the development of the scientific revolution and new ideas of sort of moral, social, political thought. So they're all connected. And this is what we are going to be learning throughout every unit as we move through sort of our time periods. We're going to be understanding that things are always building upon one thing after another. So go ahead and make sure you filled out your lecture guide if you haven't done so already, and complete all of the remaining components for Unit 1. All right, thanks guys. I hope everything's going well.